There is a moment in rock and roll history that most people never heard about. Not because it was hidden, but because the music that followed it was so loud it drowned out everything that came before. It was the moment when the king of one era looked at the boy who would define the next and decided he was nothing. And then that boy went out and built a stage so enormous, so charged with electricity and defiance, that the whole world had no choice but to watch. This is not a story about hatred. It is a story about two very different visions of what rock and roll could be, and what happens when those visions collide at full speed in front of millions of people, with history watching from the side of the stage. Before we get there, we need to understand what Elvis Presley meant to the world, and what Mick Jagger was trying to become, and why those two things were always going to create friction. Elvis Aaron Presley did not simply become famous. He became an event when he appeared on American television in the mid-1950s, performing with a physical energy that nobody had ever seen in a mainstream broadcast. The reaction was not just excitement, it was panic. Parents across the United States watched their children scream at a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, who moved in ways that polite society had decided were dangerous, and those parents were terrified, not because the music was bad, but because it was working. Elvis Presley was the first rock and roll figure to make the establishment genuinely afraid. He took the sound of Black American music, the blues, the gospel, the raw emotional current of rhythm and blues, and delivered it through a face and a voice that broke every demographic barrier of the time. He was not just a singer, he was a rupture in the culture. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Elvis had completed his military service and moved into a different phase of his career. The films, the ballads, the carefully managed public image that his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had constructed with extraordinary precision. The raw edge was still there in flashes, but the machine around Elvis had grown enormous and protective. He was the king, and kings do not throw themselves into the chaos of the street anymore. Then, from across the Atlantic Ocean, something started happening that nobody in the American music establishment had quite anticipated. The boy at the center of that something was born Michael Philip Jagger on July 26, 1943, in Dartford, England. Dartford was a respectable, quiet, thoroughly unexciting town in Kent. His father was a physical education teacher. His mother was a hairdresser. The family was firmly middle class, the kind of household where you were expected to study well and find a sensible profession. The world Mick Jagger grew up in had a clear path laid out for him, and almost nothing about that path involved crawling across a stage in front of 60,000 screaming people. But there was music, there was always music. And the music that reached Mick Jagger as a child came from America. It came from the blues. As a young boy, Jagger developed an obsession with American rhythm and blues records that felt like a doorway into a completely different world. Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Little Richard. He carried those records around with him like sacred objects. Then, on an ordinary morning in 1961, at the Dartford train station, Jagger ran into someone he had not seen since primary school, Keith Richards. The two teenagers recognized each other, and Richards noticed what Jagger was carrying: a collection of rhythm and blues albums, including records by Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters. That shared passion ignited something immediate and permanent. Within weeks, they were playing music together. Within months, they had connected with a guitarist named Brian Jones, who was already running a blues group in London. What happened next was the Rolling Stones. Understanding what the Rolling Stones were in their earliest form requires understanding what they were not. They were not the Beatles. They were not trying to be charming. They were not trying to be lovable. From the very beginning, the image surrounding the Rolling Stones was designed to make people uncomfortable. While the Beatles wore matching suits and smiled for cameras, the Rolling Stones looked like they had just come in from the street. Their early manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, understood something crucial about the marketplace of rebellion. He positioned the Rolling Stones not as alternatives to the Beatles, but as threats to everything the Beatles represent. The campaign was simple and effective. Would you let your daughter go out with a Rolling Stone? The answer, for most parents, was an emphatic no, which meant every teenager in Britain desperately wanted to. By the early 1960s, Elvis Presley was watching all of this from Memphis, Tennessee, from behind the walls of Graceland. From inside the carefully managed structure of his career, he had opinions about British rock and roll. He had opinions about these groups crossing the Atlantic and taking over his country's radio stations and teenage hearts. Elvis had invented this world. He had paid for it with his youth and his privacy. And now here were these English boys, kids who had grown up listening to American blues records in small English bedrooms, arriving in his country and being treated like gods. Elvis's feelings about British rock and roll were complicated. Those close to him in that period have described a man who felt genuine ownership over rock and roll, who believed that what was happening in Britain was derivative. He had done this first. He had done it harder. He had done it when doing it meant real social consequences, real resistance from a culture that genuinely wanted to shut him down. These British groups were walking through a door he had kicked in with his bare hands. When it came to Mick Jagger, specifically, and it is important to note that historical accounts of exactly what was said and when are filtered through memory and mythology, the contempt was focused. Jagger's movement, Jagger's style, the way Jagger performed. Elvis reportedly looked at Mick Jagger and saw someone doing a cheap imitation. Someone borrowing danger without having earned it. Someone performing rebellion as a costume rather than living it as a truth. Word of these sentiments traveled, and Mick Jagger heard them. Here is what you need to understand about Mick Jagger, because this is the part most people miss entirely. Jagger was not a simple person. He was not the pure instinctive rock animal that his image suggested. He was a student at the London School of Economics before he chose music. He read widely. He thought carefully. He understood power structures and cultural dynamics in ways that very few rock performers of his generation did. When Jagger received information, including information that the king of rock and roll considered him a fraud, he did not simply react with anger. He processed it. He filed it, and then he went to work. The work happened on stages. The Rolling Stones toured relentlessly through the 1960s. While Elvis was making films in Hollywood, the Rolling Stones were building a live reputation that was genuinely frightening in its intensity. Their concerts were not events you watched calmly from your seat. Audiences rioted. Venues suffered damage. Girls fainted and screamed with a ferocity that had not been seen since the early, pre-Hollywood Elvis. The energy was real and it was escalating. Mick Jagger was the engine of that energy. But what makes his story genuinely extraordinary is that he was not simply releasing energy onto a crowd. He was directing it. He was conducting it. He was a performer of extraordinary precision operating inside what looked like pure chaos, and the combination was unlike anything rock and roll had ever produced. Watch footage from the Rolling Stones concerts of the mid-1960s, and you will see a young man who moves like nothing that existed before him. He drew from everything. From the black American blues and soul performers he had studied obsessively, from the stagecraft of British theater, from his own instinctive understanding of how a body in motion creates meaning. His hips, his lips, his hands on the microphone. Every element was alive, communicating something, pulling the audience deeper into a collective experience that bypassed rational thought entirely. This was not imitation. This was transformation. Jagger had taken influences from everywhere and synthesized them into something entirely and unmistakably his own. The way Muddy Waters moved was not the way Mick Jagger moved. Jagger was a new creature, assembled from many parts but belonging to no category that existed before him. And then the songs came. Satisfaction, released in 1965, was a declaration. The guitar riff that opens that song is one of the most immediately recognizable sounds in the history of recorded music. It announced itself as something that could not be ignored. It went to #1 in the United States and stayed there. It made the Rolling Stones not just a British phenomenon, but a global force. Following Satisfaction came Paint It Black, with its sitar-driven darkness and uncompromising emotional landscape. Sympathy for the Devil, which positioned Jagger as narrator of history's worst moments with a theatrical daring that had no precedent in popular music. Jumpin' Jack Flash, which arrived like a thunderclap and announced that the band was not finished, not slowing down. Gimme Shelter, which opened with one of the most ominous guitar lines ever recorded and built to a vision of the world coming apart that felt, in 1969, uncomfortably accurate. These were not songs in the ordinary sense, they were events. Meanwhile, the distance between the two men's trajectories had become impossible to ignore. Elvis Presley's situation in the late 1960s was genuinely painful to observe. Trapped inside a career structure built by Connell Parker, surrounded by people who insulated him from honest feedback, working on films that satisfied nobody and records that felt increasingly disconnected from what was actually happening. In music, Elvis was a man of extraordinary talent, operating inside a machine that had stopped serving him. The genius surfaced in spectacular moments. The 1968 television special reminded the world what Elvis could do when given real creative freedom. Standing there in black leather, he proved the fire was still burning. It was one of the great moments in rock and roll television. But afterward, Elvis went back into the machine. The Las Vegas residency, the jumpsuits, the comfortable distance from the street, level rawness that had made him revolutionary. Jagger was watching. It would be too simple to say he watched with satisfaction. The historical record suggests genuine respect for what Elvis had accomplished, for the door he had kicked open. But Jagger was also acutely aware of the cautionary tale embedded in Elvis's trajectory. The manager who controlled too much, the yes men who protected too thoroughly, the commercial machine that swallowed the artist. Jagger was determined not to become that. The Rolling Stones did not have a Connell Tom Parker. The fundamental creative and business decisions always remained closer to the band itself. Jagger became increasingly involved in the strategic dimensions of the band's career. The touring, the contracts, the image management, the long-term positioning. He was not simply the frontman. He was one of the architects. This combination of wild performance and careful strategy set Jagger apart from almost every other rock frontman of his. Most rock stars understood only the art or only the business. Jagger insisted on understanding both. The 1969 American tour was a turning point. The Rolling Stones had not toured the United States in 3 years. When they returned, they declared themselves the greatest rock and roll band in the world, a title they applied with a combination of irony and complete sincerity. The shows were massive. The response was overwhelming, and Jagger's performance, refined over years of constant touring, had reached a level of theatrical power that was genuinely unprecedented. Watching footage from that tour, you see something that goes beyond rock and roll performance. You see theater, a man who has studied not just music, but the full vocabulary of performance. Movement, space, timing, audience psychology. Deploying all of it simultaneously, he would prowl the stage like something caged and dangerous. He would stop completely, go utterly still, and let the silence do the work. He would descend into the crowd and then return, and the return itself was an event. He understood that the concert was not just the music. It was everything: the lights, the space, the anticipation, the release, the collective experience of being in that room at that moment. Then came 1972, the Exile on Main Street tour, an album and a tour that many critics still regard as the peak of what the Rolling Stones ever achieved. The album was dense, raw, layered, and completely indifferent to radio-friendly polish. The tour that followed was an exercise in rock and roll mythology, making that has never quite been repeated. People who attended those concerts have described altered states. They describe feeling like the floor might give way. They describe Jagger as something barely human on those stages, something more like a force of nature that had decided to take the shape of a person. Elvis Presley was in Las Vegas. This is not said with cruelty. Elvis performing in Las Vegas still drew enormous crowds and still delivered moments of genuine vocal magnificence. But there was a context problem. Las Vegas was where entertainers went when they wanted safety and a guaranteed audience. It was the opposite of the volatile, anything can happen energy that had made Elvis dangerous in the first place. The two approaches to stardom could not have been more different, and the contrast was not lost on the broader culture. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977 in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 42 years old. His death was a shock, but it was also the end of a story that had been moving toward a sad conclusion for some time. Mick Jagger was 34 years old when Elvis died. His reaction, as reported by those around him, was complicated. There was grief, genuine grief for a figure who had meant everything to the music he loved. There was also a quiet, private reckoning with what Elvis's story meant, what it meant to let the machine run you instead of running the machine, what it meant to stop fighting. Jagger has never stopped fighting. The Rolling Stones in the 1980s faced a different challenge, not the establishment, not moral panics, but time itself and the internal tensions that accumulate when a band spends 2 decades under extreme pressure. The relationship between Jagger and Keith Richards deteriorated significantly in the mid-1980s. The two men who had built everything together were barely speaking. Jagger pursued a solo career. Richards was scathing. The band that had survived everything seemed unable to survive themselves. But they came back. They always came back. The Rolling Stones returned in 1989 with the Steel Wheels Tour, and what they brought back was not nostalgia, it was proof. The tour was the highest grossing concert tour in history at that time. It ran for 14 months. It played to over 6 million people across 4 continents. And at the center of all of it, every night, was a 46-year-old man who moved like the stage could not contain him, who delivered 2.5 hours of physical performance that would have exhausted people half his age. He had spent the intervening years doing something that almost no rock performer has ever done successfully, maintaining serious physical fitness as a genuine professional practice. He studied dance. He worked with choreographers. He trained his body the way an elite athlete trains, because he understood that what he did required exactly that kind of commitment. When Elvis had grown physically limited in his later years, the body that had been such a central part of his power had become something working against him. Jagger was not going to let that happen. The Voodoo Lounge Tour in 1994, the Bridges to Babylon Tour in 1997, the Licks Tour from 2000 to 2003, the A Bigger Bang Tour from 2005 to 2007, which broke the record for the highest grossing concert tour in history, a record the Rolling Stones themselves had already set and broken. Each tour was a new argument. Each tour was Jagger walking back onto that stage and making the same point he had been making since the early 1960s, with even more evidence to support it in 2013. The Rolling Stones marked their 50th anniversary as a band with concerts that drew reviewers who had been writing about them for 30 years and still found themselves struggling to explain what Jagger did on those stages. How a man approaching his 70s could generate that quality of energy. How the performance could still feel dangerous and alive when the person delivering it had surely done this thousands of times. Keith Richards once said something about his bandmate that cuts to the heart of what makes Jagger's story unusual. He said that what Mick brought to the stage was not something you could fake or learn from a book or lose with age. It was a quality of attention, of presence, of total commitment to the act of performance that existed at the same level whether the audience was 50 people or 50,000. The comparison with Elvis Presley, more than 60 years after those early encounters between their two visions of rock and roll, is instructive rather than diminishing to either man. Elvis Presley changed the world. He did it first, he did it when it was genuinely dangerous, and he paid an enormous personal price. His influence on Mick Jagger, on every performer who came after him, cannot be overstated. Without Elvis, there is no framework for what Jagger was able to build. But Jagger built something that Elvis, for reasons partly circumstantial and partly the result of choices made by those around him, was never able to build. He built sustainability. He built a relationship with the stage that deepened rather than diminished over decades. A career that did not peak in youth and spend 40 years in slow retreat, but instead continued to evolve, to take on new dimensions, to find new arguments to make. The skinny boy from Dartford who carried those American blues records to the train station in 1961 did not simply become. He became the argument for what a rock star could be if they never stopped working, never stopped learning, never stopped treating the stage as a place where something real had to happen every single night. The disagreement between Elvis Presley's vision and Mick Jagger's was never really about who was better or who deserved the title of king. It was about two fundamentally different relationships with time. Elvis compressed everything into the white heat of youth and early genius. Jagger stretched everything out over decades of physical discipline and creative restlessness and strategic intelligence, and in doing so created something rock and roll had never produced before. An icon who refused to become a monument, a rebel who refused to become respectable, a performer who understood, perhaps better than anyone in the history of the form, that the stage is not a place you visit. It is a place you live. And that living there, truly living there, requires everything you have, every night, for as long as you have the courage to keep showing up. Mick Jagger has never stopped showing up. And that, more than any comparison, more than any rivalry, more than any moment of dismissal or provocation, is the story.